Hey guys, tonight we will draw back the curtain on a deep historical abyss that most textbooks intentionally overlook. Together, we will uncover 19 disgusting hygiene and medical practices hidden behind the regal and splendid facade of King Henry VIII. Prepare yourselves, because what you are about to hear will make you extremely grateful for simple things like soap, clean water, and a functional toilet. We are going to explore the most putrid, painful, and filthy corners of this monarch's daily life. I especially suggest you patiently stick around until habit number 14, as it involves a treatment method so shocking and brutal it will send shivers down your spine. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Before we begin tonight's journey, I want to know where you are. Please leave a comment telling me where you live and what your current local time is. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first disgusting hygiene habit: groom of the stool, the royal toilet attendant and politics beside the throne. In the Tudor court, the groom of the stool was a real position, and while the title may sound amusing, it was actually one of the most powerful roles beside the king. Literally translated, it means the man who attends the royal stool, or the king's toilet attendant. The nobleman personally responsible for cleaning King Henry VIII whenever he answered the call of nature. It sounds like a degrading job, but it was in fact assigned to noblemen, men who had fought in battles, owned estates, and were highly educated. To be allowed near the king in his most private moments required absolute trust. They didn't just wipe, they observed and reported in detail to the royal physicians on the color, texture, odor, and frequency of the king's excrement. In the 16th century, doctors believed the human body was governed by the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Therefore, the king's feces were treated as sacred biological decrees, revealing not only his health, but the fate of the entire realm. Inside the small chamber, Henry VIII sat upon his close stool, a velvet-covered commode with a brass chamber pot beneath. He often conducted business there, discussing state affairs while on the throne in the most literal sense, receiving French ambassadors, debating the Pope, or approving decrees, all while his groom of the stool knelt silently nearby with a perfumed cloth in hand. No one dared to flinch or grimace. Even a single twitch of disgust could be interpreted as an insult to royal dignity and possibly cost a man his head. On days when the king suffered diarrhea, waste splattered across his velvet garments and stained the attendant's sleeves. On constipated days, the groom would kneel for hours, listening to strained grunts and counting the heavy, laboured breaths. He had to reassure the monarch that the humours are balanced, even as he knew the king's intestines were fermenting with meat, sugar and ale, a royal brew of decay from an age that didn't understand fibre. This job was both humiliating and perilous, yet it came with rare privileges: proximity, access, and the king's absolute confidence. The groom of the stool often wielded more influence than ministers, for the man who cleaned the king was also the man who held the keys to the kingdom. In a world where stench was masked with rosewater and dignity was stitched in velvet, the truth was unavoidably human. The mightiest empire in England was governed beside the royal toilet of a man with a troubled gut. The second disgusting hygiene habit: gluttony, inactivity, and the night of breathless silence. The accident of year 1536 marked the beginning of King Henry VIII's decline. Thrown from his armoured horse during a jousting tournament, the impact crushed his leg and trapped him in a body that would never heal. He stopped moving, but he never stopped eating. What had once been the appetite of an athlete became the obsession of a man filling an emptiness no medicine could reach. Each royal meal was a performance of power: swans roasted whole, peacocks stuffed with other birds, venison, beef, mutton, pork and goose. Sugared pastries glittered like jewels, followed by marzipan castles sculpted from almond paste and dyed in brilliant colours. A single meal could reach 5,000 calories, and there were 2 such meals every day. Vegetables were dismissed as food for peasants. Fibre disappeared from the royal diet entirely. Sugar, imported at immense cost, became the symbol of empire-refined power served on golden plates. As the years passed, Henry's waistline expanded, until his belts no longer fit. His breathing shortened, his movements slowed. By night, the palace echoed with his thunderous snores, then sudden silence. Courtiers stationed outside his bedchamber would count the pauses 30 seconds, 45, until the quiet became unbearable. They would rush in, shaking King awake, and he would gasp like a man surfacing from drowning. By morning he was exhausted, his body swollen. Walking even a few steps left him panting. His legs, already scarred by infection, ballooned until the skin stretched shiny and thin. Veins bulged like dark cords beneath the surface. The flesh wept clear fluid that stained his stockings. Servants wrapped the limbs in linen, whispering prayers against bursting. The king's custom-built chair groaned under his weight. Stairs required several strong men to lift him. And yet, in every mirror, in every portrait, Henry demanded a slimmer reflection. Painters lengthened his torso, narrowed his face, painted vigor where there was decay. The image of the powerful monarch endured. The man beneath the velvet did not. Meals became political theatre. To eat was to rule, to consume was to command. Rejecting food was interpreted as weakness, as insult, even as treason. Each banquet reaffirmed his dominance, a declaration that the King of England could devour more than any man alive. But each mouthful was also a wound, the heart straining to push blood through layers of fat, the liver drowning in wine, the kidneys overworked from purges and diuretics. By the early 1540s, Henry's nights were a cycle of suffocation and terror. Modern physicians would call it sleep apnea, the soft tissues of his throat collapsing under the weight of his own flesh, cutting off air until reflex jolted him awake. But in Tudor England, it was described as the king's night fits. Servants spoke of eerie silences followed by violent gasps. Some swore they heard him mutter prayers between snores, as if bargaining for one more breath. Every morning began the same way, exhaustion masked by ceremony. He dressed in gold, crimson, and fur. He signed decrees, dispensed justice, condemned traitors while his pulse hammered and his vision dimmed. The air around him reeked faintly of sweat and illness, a scent of slow decay hidden under perfume. And through it all, Henry refused restraint. Physicians suggested moderation. He dismissed them. Advisors hinted at fasting. He replaced them. Even the mirror's betrayal was corrected by art. Reality was rewritten in paint and flattery. In the end, his indulgence became its own punishment. The once athletic prince who could ride for hours was now lifted like cargo. The mighty lungs that had shouted commands across battlefields struggled for a single quiet breath. Each night, when the court fell silent, the palace waited for the inevitable pause, the gap in sound when even kings forget to breathe. Because no crown, no banquet, no kingdom can buy the simplest gift of life, one clean, effortless breath. The third disgusting hygiene habit, a bedroom turned infirmary, and a bed that became a throne. King Henry VIII's bed was nearly 3 meters wide, an enormous structure carved with lions and dragons, symbols of royal strength that mocked the frail body lying upon it. The mattress sagged deeply in the center, not from years of use, but from the sheer weight of the king and the pus that seeped nightly from his ulcers. Beneath layers of velvet sheets, his attendants spread sheepskin to absorb the fluids that leaked from his rotting leg. Every morning the ritual began like a grotesque liturgy. Servants scraped the dried pus from the sheets with silver knives, then sprinkled herbal powder across the stained fabric, as though embalming a man who had not yet died. At night, the royal bedchamber was not a sanctuary. It was a hospital ward, a chapel, a council room, all contained within the stifling air of sickness. Physicians hovered close, pressing their hands to the king's forehead to gauge his fever. Priests murmured prayers over his wheezing breaths, whispering Latin phrases meant to drive out demons or disease. Courtiers debated matters of state at the foot of the bed, speaking softly while Henry lay half reclined, his enormous body glistening with sweat, his eyes dull from pain and exhaustion. The smell was unbearable. The mixture of infection, ointment, and decay filled the heavy drapes. Even the perfumed oils burned in silver lamps could not disguise it. In the summer heat, the stench thickened. His sheets became heavy with moisture, soaked not only with sweat, but with the discharge from festering sores. The coverlets, once embroidered with gold thread, were darkened by years of seepage. To touch them was to feel death still breathing. The bed itself had become a stage where medicine and monarchy blended into a grim spectacle. The king's physicians approached him not as a patient, but as a battlefield. They opened wounds, drained pus, and packed them again with herbs and egg whites, hoping to draw out corruption. Each movement made Henry groan. Each touch drew curses or prayers. When he could not rise, decrees were brought to him. His trembling hand, swollen from gout and infection, signed orders of execution, promotions, treaties, all from between his sweat-soaked pillows. The attendants who served him learned precision. One misstep could be fatal to them. They learned how to lift his vast frame without tearing fragile skin, how to slip the chamber pot from beneath the velvet sheets without spilling, how to wipe him clean without letting disgust show in their eyes. They moved like shadows, silent and obedient, their own faces pale under the candlelight. Sometimes, late in the night, the bed was surrounded by layers of contradiction, royal dignity and biological ruin, prayers for mercy and orders for war, gold embroidery over decaying flesh. The bed where queens had once conceived heirs was now a medical station for a dying empire. His body, bloated, infected, and immobile, was England in miniature, powerful on the surface, collapsing underneath. Henry's breathing filled the chamber, slow, wet, irregular. The ticking of his pulse echoed in the stillness. The courtiers outside listened, waiting for the moment when it stopped. Yet he kept ruling. Even from that bed, even surrounded by rot, he clung to authority. Orders were shouted between gasps. Ministers knelt beside his mattress to receive commands. Every movement of the sheets stirred a wave of odor, and the reminder that the ruler of England was decomposing while alive. That was the paradox of Henry's final years. The bed that once symbolized love and dynasty had become a throne of decay. The king never truly slept, and the kingdom never truly rested. In that vast, perfumed coffin of velvet and wood, the empire itself tossed and turned restless, fevered, and unable to dream. The fourth disgusting hygiene habit: opiates, strong wine, and the soothing draughts of the Middle Ages. In the final years of his reign, King Henry VIII became not only a prisoner of his own body, but also of the potions meant to quiet its agony. The infections in his leg, the fevers, the gout, all of it, drove him toward the dark medicine of the age. Laudanum, a thick, bitter mixture of alcohol and opium dissolved with honey, vinegar, and crushed herbs. A single diluted spoonful in wine helped him drift into shallow sleep. 2 spoonfuls plunged him into delirium. His lips turned faintly blue, his pulse slowed, his speech slurred into nonsense. Sometimes the royal physicians added powder of pearls for purity, or ground amber and powdered deer horn, believed to calm the fiery humours of the blood. Each new ingredient was a guess in the dark, an alchemy of desperation. After every dose, Henry's breathing grew heavy, his eyes glassy. By dawn, the stupor lifted just enough for him to shout. He demanded more. His courtiers knew that refusal was dangerous, but compliance more so. The same medicine that soothed his pain was eating away what was left of his mind. The mixture of opium and wine became his invisible crown. He sipped it before council meetings, before mass, before signing death warrants. He called it my comfort. But by the year 1543, his comfort ruled him instead. The court began to move as though underwater. Orders were repeated twice, sometimes 3 times, as the king's mind drifted in and out of clarity. On certain mornings he appeared alert, red-faced, decisive, demanding. By noon his speech slurred, his hand trembled, his thoughts unravelled. Once he fell asleep mid-decree, and the Lord Chancellor quietly replaced the unsigned papers, affixed the royal seal himself, and let the matter pass. The governance of England continued like a shadow play, its puppet master drugged and dreaming. At night, the laudanum deepened its hold. The king's attendants described him murmuring names, some familiar, others forgotten, his words dissolving into prayer. Then gibberish. His breath reeked of vinegar and wine. His tongue stained dark. In moments of lucidity, he clutched at the bedpost, whispering that his body was turning to stone. The physicians responded with yet more soothing draughts. The cycle began again. The records of his apothecaries list ingredients in a chilling rhythm: poppy syrup, saffron, musk, myrrh, opium, sugar of roses. Remedies for pain became instruments of dependence. Even his confessor noticed it, how the king prayed with fervour in the morning, then forgot his own prayers by dusk. The man who had once broken England from Rome now struggled to break from a bottle. The same will that defied the Pope could not defy withdrawal. His attendants spoke of his eyes, dull and sunken, and his breath, heavy with sweetness and decay. He was both ruler and captive, trapped between pain and oblivion. By the last winter of his life, Henry's daily routine was half liturgy, half sedation. He would wake to wine, dose himself through midday, and drift into stupor before evening prayers. The courtiers learned silence. They bowed, obeyed, and signed his name where his trembling hand could not. England was ruled through fog, its decrees born from the dreams of a man half asleep. The habit of numbing pain with intoxication was the final stage of his decay. For a king who once commanded armies, shattered churches, and reshaped his nation, the last enemy was not Rome, not France, not rebellion, but his own sleepless mind. In the flicker of candlelight, between sips of drugged wine and murmured commands, the great Henry VIII waged his last war, the battle to rest, to forget, to breathe without pain. And as his pulse slowed under the weight of his soothing draughts, the empire itself seemed to exhale a long, weary sigh from a kingdom ruled by a dreamer who could no longer wake. The fifth disgusting hygiene habit, reviving manhood, with sparrow brains, rhino horn, and instruments of restraint. When the body begins to betray its master, pride searches for miracles. By the late 1530s, King Henry VIII's failing health extended to the most private realm of all. The once vigorous monarch, who had fathered children with the confidence of divine right, now faced the quiet humiliation of impotence. His table, already burdened with roasted beasts and sugared towers, became an altar to desperation. Each evening, the king's apothecaries prepared their strengthening tonics: oysters for virility, sparrow brains fried in butter, powdered rhinoceros horn imported at the price of gold, ground antler from the royal hunting parks, and spiced wines, thick with ginger, cinnamon, and cloves. These concoctions scorched the throat and flushed the face, but did nothing to wake the weary machinery of a body drowning in its own decay. When food failed, came poultices. Royal physicians smeared ginger and mustard directly onto the king's groin, proclaiming that it would rekindle the humours and restore heat to cold blood. The result was agony, burning skin, blistered flesh, and the faint, acrid smell of desperation disguised as medicine. Henry clenched his jaw and endured, while the doctors nodded solemnly, declaring that the royal vigour is returning. But it was not. By the early 1540s, his condition had worsened. The leg ulcers oozed continuously. His breath reeked of infection. He was too heavy to move without help, too weak to stand unaided, yet his pride demanded the illusion of virility. Thus began the final and most grotesque experiment: mechanical assistance. Hidden beneath velvet robes and golden embroidery were crude devices, rings of leather lined with tiny metal beads, tightened at the base to trap blood. Wooden or iron bands fitted around the thighs to create friction. They were instruments of humiliation disguised as royal remedies. Servants and physicians adjusted them in silence. The king's skin bruised, the pain made him tremble. Yet he endured, sweating not from passion, but from the pressure of restraint. During council meetings, when he shifted uneasily on the throne, courtiers pretended not to notice. The redness of his face, once interpreted as fury, was now the blush of agony. Beneath layers of brocade, the straps bit into flesh already tender with sores. Each movement produced a muffled creak, the sound of wood against leather, a reminder that even kings are bound by the limits of flesh. No one dared speak of it. In a court where the smallest jest could cost a head, the truth was buried under titles and euphemisms. "The king's vitality endures," whispered the physicians. "His strength is being restored," said the courtiers. But everyone knew. What remained was performance. And so the legend of Henry's potency was built not on power, but on silence. The sparrow-brain suppers, the golden vials of powdered horn, the secret belts and pulleys all became part of a myth carefully staged to protect royal pride. Even chroniclers, writing decades later, preserved the illusion that the great king was as strong in his bed as on his throne. In reality, the body that once defied popes and nations was now a prison of rotting muscle and unrelenting shame. Every attempt to revive manhood only deepened the wound proof that no empire, however vast, could conquer the quiet rebellion of biology. And when the feasts ended and the candles burned low, the palace fell into uneasy silence. Only the slow ticking of the clock and the faint groan of wooden braces broke the stillness. Somewhere beneath the brocade sheets, a man once the most powerful in Europe lay awake, bound by straps and illusions, his pride tightening around him like a noose. In that soundless chamber, the myth of invincibility collapsed. The hum of gears, the faint creak of leather, those were not the echoes of strength regained, but the whisper of a dying vanity struggling against time itself. The sixth disgusting hygiene habit: no bathing, unwashed clothes, and the art of surviving the royal stench. By the 16th century, medical theory had turned against the very idea of bathing. Physicians warned that open pores invited miasma, poisonous air carrying disease. To cleanse the skin, they said, was to invite death through invisible holes. Thus, King Henry VIII, like most of his court, believed that a full bath was dangerous. Water might weaken the body, stir the humours, or awaken infection. Instead, the king practiced what was then considered prudent hygiene: dry washing. Each morning, servants wiped his skin with fine linen cloths soaked in rosewater, vinegar, or crushed herbs. The result was less cleanliness than perfume layered over decay. Sweat, oil, and pus from his ulcers mingled with scented cloth, spreading across his enormous body in streaks of damp aroma. His garments, linen undershirts, wool doublets, velvet cloaks, and fur linings were almost never washed. Cleaning meant hanging them in sunlight, beating out the dust, and sprinkling them with lavender or thyme. The fabrics absorbed the royal scent, a blend of musk, alcohol, rot, and sweetness. Over time, the fibers themselves became waxy, stiff, and faintly greasy. The smell of the monarchy was no metaphor. It was a physical thing that filled the air. In the summer months, the king's chambers became an oven. The heavy drapes trapped heat and moisture, the carpets absorbed it. Beneath the bed, chamber pots steamed faintly, their contents emptied too seldom. The scent of wine, ointment, and infection hung thick. Courtiers joked quietly that one breath near the king was worth a doctor's salary. Ambassadors left written accounts of audiences where the odour was so powerful that men grew faint. The French envoy once described a closeness most grievous to the head. Some clasped the arms of their chairs, knuckles white, struggling to breathe through their mouths. Others dabbed handkerchiefs with mint oil or cloves, pressing them discreetly against their noses while bowing. The courtiers developed an etiquette of survival. They learned to stand with the wind at their backs. They rubbed mint beneath their nostrils before entering the royal chamber. Some carried pomanders, spheres filled with ambergris and herbs, holding them close to the mouth as though deep in thought. The trick was to appear reverent while hiding one's horror. The king himself no longer noticed. Years of festering ulcers and chronic sinus infections had dulled his sense of smell. To him, the room was normal. To others, it was suffocating. His physicians pretended not to notice. His attendants pretended not to suffer. To mention the odour was to risk offence, and in Tudor England, offending the king was an act of suicide. Every object in his presence absorbed the corruption of his body. The sheets, the pillows, the curtains, even the golden canopy above the bed. When soiled bandages were burned, their smell lingered for days. When new robes were brought in, they quickly took on the same scent as the old. The very air seemed saturated with him. The royal laundresses, tasked with maintaining his wardrobe, faced an impossible job. They scrubbed stains with vinegar and soap wort, hung the fabrics to dry in smoke from juniper branches, and prayed that the perfume of the herbs would mask the truth. It never did. The odour was stronger than ritual, and yet the machinery of state continued within this invisible cloud. Courtiers read decrees, secretaries wrote letters, ministers debated policy, all while breathing the same heavy air. Each signature, each whispered command, passed through an atmosphere so dense it could almost be touched. In that space, ceremony triumphed over sanity. Cleanliness had surrendered to ritual, and the body of the king decaying, unwashed, perfumed with desperation, became the empire's center of gravity. The paradox was complete. In the most powerful court of Europe, water was feared more than disease, and smell bowed to no one. Within the slow rhythm of fans and the clatter of quills, the court carried on an empire perfumed with rot, crowned in velvet, and drowning quietly in its own air. The seventh disgusting hygiene habit, terrified of death, yet obsessed with its ceremony. By the early year 1541, King Henry VIII had begun rehearsing his own death like a sacred ritual. He ordered that a coffin be constructed for him in advance, its lid cast in bronze and engraved with St. George slaying the dragon, a thinly veiled image of himself conquering evil even beyond the grave. To those around him, it was both morbid and inevitable. The king who once rewrote the laws of heaven now sought to command what lay beneath it. Each illness became a dress rehearsed for dying. Whenever fever struck or the leg ulcers festered beyond control, priests were summoned to the royal chamber to administer extreme unction, the final rite. They stood ready with holy oil and silver crucifix, but the king often waved them away at the last moment, terrified that accepting the ritual would mean admitting weakness. He wanted the comfort of absolution, without the implication of surrender. In his private wardrobes lay a peculiar collection, burial shrouds of white linen, embroidered in gold thread, folded with care beside perfumed gloves and court robes. The servants polished the coffin's fittings as they might polish armor. Henry treated his funeral garments not as symbols of humility, but as trophies, a final display of majesty. He feared sickness with a kind of fascination. Reports from his physicians and spies detailed the symptoms of others, the color of a bishop's skin before death, the way a nobleman's breath faltered, the odor of a corpse after 3 days. The king demanded these details not out of pity, but control. If he could name every stage of decay, he could imagine mastery over it. This obsession turned into a ritual of its own. He surrounded himself with relics, charms, and ceremonial order. Every candle in his chapel was placed to face east. Every crucifix was polished until it gleamed. His attendants whispered prayers not for mercy, but for precision, each word aligned like the gears of a clock. The greater his terror of death, the more elaborate his defenses became. Even in conversation, he could not escape it. Courtiers reported that Henry often spoke of the manner of dying, as though it were a strategy of state. He discussed how kings should die bravely, publicly, unrepentantly, then lapsed into silence, stroking the gold cross at his chest. The contradiction was stark. The man who had beheaded wives and bishops now trembled at the shadow of his own mortality. When he felt his strength falter, he demanded readings from the Book of Job and the Psalms of David, verses describing kings brought low and flesh turned to dust. Yet he forbade anyone from uttering the word death in his presence. The court learned to speak in euphemism. His majesty rests, his strength wavers, the humors are disturbed. To say otherwise was treason to hope. In the end, the rituals devoured him. His need to control became a labyrinth of gestures, candles relit, prayers repeated, robes rearranged. Each action was meant to impose order on the one thing he could not command. When the real moment arrived, there were no decrees, no blessings, only the body of a man slipping beyond his own reach. Witnesses described the final hours in January of the year 1547, the king half-conscious, his breathing ragged, the priests too afraid to speak the last rites aloud without permission. His sweat soaked the sheets. His lips moved in silent protest. Around him hung the mingled scents of silver crucifix, pine resin, and the faint, fishy odor of decay. The chamber that had once echoed with proclamations, now filled with the sound of labored breaths, each one shorter than the last. The man who had commanded an empire could not command another breath. The candles burned low. A draught passed through the window, carrying the faint smell of wax and salt. Henry VIII, who had conquered kingdoms, churches, and wives, died as he had lived, surrounded by ceremony, desperate for control, and betrayed by the body he ruled like a nation. His final habit, the worship of ritual in the face of decay, was not merely superstition. It was the last illusion of a king who believed even death could be managed, if only the candles were straight and the prayers recited in time. And as the chamber fell silent, one truth lingered heavier than the scent of incense. No ritual, however holy, could mask the stench of mortality. The eighth disgusting hygiene habit: leg ulcers, reused bandages, and the red-hot iron. After the terrible jousting accident of the year 1536, King Henry VIII carried a wound that would never heal. What began as a bruise on his lower leg turned into a spreading ulcer, an open sore that oozed pus and blood for 11 long years. The pain was relentless. The leg swelled, throbbed, and leaked a foul-smelling discharge that followed him from chamber to chamber, leaving a stench no perfume could hide. The royal physicians, still guided by the medieval theory of the four humours, believed that the wound must drain the excess heat and bad blood from the body. To close it, they warned, would mean death. So they did the opposite. They kept it open. Every few days, servants unwrapped layers of filthy linen, stiff with pus and dried blood. The bandages were not sterilized. They were rinsed, dried, and reused week after week. Some were tacked with mixtures of egg white, pine resin, vinegar, or crushed herbs. Others were soaked in honey or wine, thought to draw out the poison. Each time the cloth was removed, a portion of flesh came with it. The attendants peeled it away slowly, careful not to provoke the king's rage. The sight was enough to make grown men gag. Ambassadors recorded the smell as grievous and unendurable. One French envoy excused himself mid-audience, retching as he fled the room. When the ulcer began to close naturally, a sign in truth of possible recovery, the doctors panicked. To them, a sealed wound trapped the corruption inside. They decided the sore must be reopened. And so came the iron. In a small dim chamber, the brazier glowed red. A metal rod, heated until it shimmered, was brought forward. 4 men held the king's arms and shoulders as the surgeon pressed the iron to his leg. The sound was not a scream but a bellow, half animal, half human. Steam rose with the smell of burning flesh. The attendants described it as like meat upon a spit. When the iron lifted, blisters formed instantly, bubbling like wax. Afterward, new bandages were wrapped around the wound, fresh linen that would soon stiffen again with pus and blood. The cycle would repeat, endlessly. Every few weeks, when the issue began to seal, the surgeons would reopen it with a knife or iron to keep the humours flowing. It became a doctrine of maintenance through suffering. The king endured it as part of his divine destiny. Pain, he believed, was proof of purification. The ulcer was not a wound to heal, but a sacred vent, a conduit through which illness and sin might escape. His physicians called it God's mercy in flesh. His courtiers called it the issue, but to the servants who tended it, it was a living nightmare. They spoke, in whispers, of the smell that clung to everything, the bedsheets, the curtains, even the velvet of his throne. They burned the used bandages, yet the scent lingered in their hair, their clothes, their dreams. Some fainted during the dressing, others vomited quietly behind their sleeves. The king, meanwhile, sat grim and pale, gripping the armrests, insisting that the wound remain open for the sake of balance. In modern terms, Henry's ulcer was likely a chronic venous infection or osteomyelitis, worsened by obesity and diabetes. But in the 16th century, it was seen as spiritual necessity. His doctors called it the safety valve of His Majesty's constitution. Each reopening, each burning, cutting or scraping was performed with solemn ritual, as though preserving divine order. The irony was cruel. The very practice meant to preserve him hastened his decay. Bacteria multiplied, seeping into his bloodstream, poisoning him from within. The fevers that followed were dismissed as the humours adjusting. The pain that racked his body was labelled a sign of healing. In truth, he was rotting alive, and yet the ceremony continued. The iron glowed. The bandages darkened. The smell deepened. Pain became part of kingship. Infection became policy, and superstition wore the mask of medicine. By the final years, Henry's leg had become a wound that ruled the room, a presence of its own. Courtiers could tell the king was near, not by the sound of trumpets, but by the odour that entered before him. The habit of maintaining the royal issue had turned into a ritual of horror, the deliberate feeding of disease in the name of control. In the end, the sore never healed. It simply stopped being tended, as if the body had grown too tired to fight even its own rot. The man who feared closed wounds died with one still open, a fitting symbol for a reign where agony itself became a form of order, and where the body of a king was forced to bleed, endlessly, in the name of balance. The ninth disgusting hygiene habit: ignoring bone infection and letting pain shape the mind. Beneath the pus and the ulcers, modern medicine would recognize what truly consumed King Henry VIII: osteomyelitis, a chronic infection of the bone. The bacteria had tunneled deep into his thigh and shin, carving channels of pus through living tissue. Inside the bone itself, infection hollowed him out, leaving cavities that leaked, rotted, and refused to close. Without antibiotics, without sterilization, without even the concept of microbes, his body became a battlefield where infection ruled unchecked. There was no cure, only the illusion of control. Surgeons applied unwashed bandages, poultices of resin and egg white, and linen soaked in wine or herbs. They lanced the wounds to let the poison out, but each incision only opened new roads for decay. The smell of rot became part of the king's presence, a stench so constant it seemed to announce him before his voice did. The pain was unrelenting, not the surface sting of a cut, but a deep, grinding ache, the ache of bone being eaten alive. Each step, each turn in bed, each movement of his swollen leg sent a pulse of agony that climbed from limb to skull. He could no longer kneel, could barely stand, and often screamed when lifted from his chair. The pain did not simply torment his body, it rewrote his mind. Modern neuroscience shows that after 6 months of chronic pain, the brain begins to change, its emotional centers flare. Its frontal control weakens. Henry endured 11 years of such pain. The constant throbbing, the sleepless nights, the humiliation of decay all conspired to reshape him. His amygdala, the seat of anger and fear, became dominant. His prefrontal cortex, the home of reason and restraint, faded. And so, the Henry of legend, the raving tyrant, the husband who executed wives, the monarch who flayed ministers with words and steel, was in part a man remade by agony. Beneath the crown, there was the ceaseless pulse of infection. Beneath the roar, a low throb of pain that never stopped. His physicians mistook cause for character. They blamed the humours, the stars, the will of God. They bled him, purged him, blistered him, procedures that only weakened what little strength remained. Each morning he awoke in a haze of exhaustion, the leg throbbing like a second heart, and signed decrees with a trembling hand. Each evening he drowned the ache in wine and laudanum, his mind drifting between fury and stupor. The court adjusted itself around his torment. Servants moved quietly, avoiding sudden sounds that might provoke an outburst. Courtiers spoke in slow tones, measuring every word. Ministers presented documents with trembling hands, praying that the pain had dulled enough for mercy. Some days the king smiled and blessed them. Others, he tore through the room in rage. Chronic infection became state policy. The royal surgeons, terrified of sealing the wound, insisted on keeping it open. They treated the constant flow of pus as a sign of divine balance. The issue must remain, they said, lest the sickness turn inward. So they preserved the infection as a ritual, ensuring the king's suffering remained constant, believing it was the very thing that kept him alive. But it was not life they preserved. It was corrosion. The poison that seeped from his legs slowly poisoned his blood, his mind, his rule. The infection that deformed his limb also deformed his kingdom. Decisions were made in fever, executions signed in fits of agony. Diplomacy became paranoia, and justice became revenge. Every roar from the throne echoed from a deeper wound. By the final years, his courtiers could no longer tell where pain ended and personality began. He snarled at loyal servants, wept over trivialities, and accused friends of treason. The stench of infection mingled with the odor of fear. The palace, once filled with music, now smelled of vinegar, sweat, and dread. And still, the ritual continued. The bandages were changed, the wound reopened, the pus drained. No one dared suggest amputation. It would have meant admitting that the king's body, like his reign, was beyond saving. Instead, they worshipped the wound. It became an emblem of endurance, a sacred affliction that justified his rage and isolation. In the quiet rhythm of his chamber, the scraping of linen, the hiss of iron, the muffled groan, the empire learned to live by his pain. His body was the nation's weather. When the wound flared, tempests rose. When it drained, calm returned. By preserving the wound, they preserved the madness. And so the habit of ignoring infection and worshipping suffering birthed not just a disease of flesh, but a sickness of rule. The king rotted from the leg upward, and the kingdom followed, step by slow, limping step, until pain itself became the pulse of power. The 10th disgusting hygiene habit, divination through feces, and the vicious cycle of purification. In the medicine of the 16th century, the bowels were thought to hold the secrets of the soul. Physicians called it reading the body's scripture. To them, feces were not merely waste, but divine messages, a text to be interpreted. Dark stool meant excess black bile, melancholy, stagnation, perhaps death. Pale stool signified weakness of the liver. Blood in the waist pointed to damp demons or piles, a corruption of the inner humours. Each morning, the royal physicians examined the king's stool as if consulting an oracle. They described its colour, texture, and odour with reverent precision, recording in neat Latin phrases, niger et gravis, mollis et fetida. These reports were treated like sacred documents, passed from servant to doctor to astrologer, until a new treatment was prescribed. And so began the ritual of release, the endless cycle of bleeding, purging, and washing out what could never be cleansed. Whenever King Henry VIII complained of being stopped, the palace turned into a medical theatre. The ritual began with the enema, or clyster. A long metal tube, sometimes brass, sometimes silver, was fitted with a bladder made from a pig's organ. Into it, physicians poured a mixture of warm water, wine, oil, vinegar, or even milk. The tube was inserted, and the liquid forced upward. The cold rush entered like a wave of shock. The king clenched, sweated, and groaned as the fluid churned through his gut. What followed was violent. The chambermaids carried out bowls of liquid wastewater, streaked with blood, mucus, and undigested meat. The stench was unbearable, but the court recorded the results proudly. They called it purging the humours. In some weeks, the treatments were constant. Records from the royal attendants mention the king's stool being voided 8 to 9 times daily for several weeks. His chamber became a place of unending motion, bowls filled, bowls emptied, physicians murmuring prayers of balance. When enemas failed to unblock the humours, the doctors escalated. They prescribed chemical purges, mercury, antimony, and violently cathartic herbs. These substances scoured the intestines but poisoned the blood, shredded the lining of the stomach, and left the king weaker after each supposed cure. His mouth filled with a metallic taste. His skin turned pale and cold. But each collapse was followed by the same refrain. The poison leaves him. The body purifies. In truth, the more they purged, the more they destroyed. The bowels grew sluggish from exhaustion. The muscles of the gut lost tone, and natural movement ceased. The king could no longer defecate without assistance. The treatments that promised freedom had made him a prisoner to his own rituals. The paradox deepened. To relieve constipation, they prescribed more purging. To stop the weakness caused by purging, they prescribed more meat, more wine, more oil foods that only worsened the constipation. And when pain returned, they returned to the enema. The body became a battlefield. The bowels a war of superstition against nature. Inside the richly curtained chamber, the ceremony unfolded like liturgy. The king lay half naked, sheets drawn to his chest, while attendants whispered prayers and passed the instruments. The physicians moved with solemn grace, their faces expressionless. No one dared show disgust. Even this, the most degrading of procedures, was wrapped in velvet and reverence. At the end of each session, the king would collapse into his chair, trembling and pale. Sweat darkened the edges of his collar. His pulse raced. Yet he would often whisper, "The balance returns," as though convinced that suffering was the price of order. This belief that disease could be expelled by force was the essence of Tudor medicine. Illness was imagined as a demon to be driven out, a curse to be washed clean. But in Henry's case, the demon was not leaving. It was growing. Each cleansing weakened his organs. Each purge thinned his blood, inflamed his intestines, and deepened his dependency. The more he sought purity, the more corrupted his body became. By the end of his life, his digestion was ruined. His stool was described as thick and black, with an odor of decay. His belly swelled, his breathing slowed, and he often fainted during his so-called treatments. Still, the rituals continued day after day, week after week, because to stop would be to admit failure. And so the throne of England became, in its quietest hours, a chamber of exorcism. Between the folds of velvet and the flicker of candlelight, the greatest monarch of his age sat chained to a superstition, the habit of purification through pain. What he believed was science was merely ceremony. What he called cleansing was destruction. And as his body convulsed under the weight of its own rituals, one truth lingered in the heavy air. There was no balance left to restore, only the illusion of control, washed again and again in the blood and waste of the living king. The 11th disgusting hygiene habit, living with a volcano of hemorrhoids and barbaric interventions. Inside a dim chamber, thick with the smell of pine resin, sweat, and vinegar, King Henry VIII's private affliction was no secret to his physicians or attendants. What modern medicine would call hemorrhoids was, in Tudor terms, a swelling of heat and blood, an imbalance of the humours demanding release. For Henry, it was a curse that ruled his every motion. The pain was constant. The veins around his rectum bulged and tore, leaking blood and mucus, each bowel movement an agony of pressure and fire. But to the doctors of his time, the answer was not rest or hygiene. It was bloodletting. The treatment began with a blade. A surgeon, more butcher than healer, would crouch between the king's legs, holding a small, curved knife. There was no anesthesia, no sterilization, no mercy. The first incision sliced directly into the swollen veins. Thick, black blood spurted into a pewter bowl, filling the room with the smell of iron. Henry bit down on a leather strap. His knuckles turned white against the carved armrests of the chair. The attendants stood still, their faces blank. To them, this was medicine. To him, it was torture disguised as ceremony. When the bleeding slowed, the physicians declared that the excess humour has departed. But if the swelling did not subside, they went further. Herbal wicks soaked in vinegar, alum, or crushed oak gall were pushed deep into the inflamed tissue. The pain was beyond measure, a burning that crawled up his spine and clawed at his skull. The room filled with the sound of laboured breathing and the hiss of pain forced through clenched teeth. These medicated plugs, as the doctors called them, were left for hours. They stung, festered and oozed, turning each treatment into a prolonged torment. When that failed, the physicians reached for their ultimate cure, the cautery iron. The iron rod was heated until it glowed red, the metal trembling with heat. 2 attendants held the king steady, while the surgeon pressed the iron directly onto the swollen flesh. A sound like frying meat filled the chamber, a sickening hiss followed by the smell of burning skin. The king roared, the curtains trembled, yet the doctors murmured calmly about banishing the corrupted blood. Afterward, the wound was dressed with strips of linen soaked in wine and honey. The pain did not end, it deepened. Each movement of the bowel tore open what the iron had sealed. Defecation became a daily crucifixion. The royal stool, once the stage of medical ritual, now became an instrument of dread. Even sitting especially upon his throne was agony. The symbol of royal power turned into a punishment chair. He shifted constantly, wincing, sweating through layers of velvet and fur. Courtiers learned to read the signs. When the king leaned slightly to one side, when his jaw clenched mid-sentence, it meant the volcano had flared again. At times, the hemorrhoids prolapsed internal veins, pushed outward by the strain of constipation and repeated enemas. When that happened, the servants assigned to the royal stool performed their most humiliating duty. With gloved fingers, they gently pushed the swollen tissue back into place. The king would close his eyes, breath shallow, as the groom of the stool did his work in silence. There were no words for the shame, but no one dared speak of the failure of these treatments. The physicians continued to describe each episode in elegant Latin. The heat has been reduced. The corruption is expelled. The reality was far from it. Each incision invited infection. Each cautery deepened the wound. Each purge weakened his body further. The so-called cures only ensured the cycle would never end. Bleed, swell, burn, bleed again. It became a rhythm as predictable as the tolling of the court's bells. The king's body, trapped in its own rituals, mirrored the machinery of his rules, strict, repetitive, self-destructive. His agony was hidden beneath brocade and perfume, yet it shaped every decision, every temper, every silence between decrees. The smell lingered everywhere. Hot blood and sour medicine woven into the velvet curtains, soaked into the oak floorboards. Even after the bandages were changed and the room aired with herbs and incense, the metallic scent of suffering remained. Courtiers whispered that the smell followed him down the corridors, clinging to his robes like a shadow. This was the 11th horror, a habit born not from indulgence but from belief. The conviction that pain itself could purify. The king endured each new assault, not because it worked, but because it fit the doctrine that to cleanse the body, one must make it bleed. And so, night after night, he submitted again to the ritual. The knife, the wick, the iron, the prayer. A monarch flayed by superstition, trapped in a circle of agony he called healing. Outside the chamber, the court continued music, banquets, politics. But inside, beneath the banners of empire, the most powerful man in England trembled from wounds too intimate to name, while the smell of scorched flesh drifted softly through the velvet air. The 12th, disgusting hygiene habit, risky pleasures, and the miracle cure of mercury. Behind the velvet curtains and the music of courtly revels, the royal bedchamber of King Henry VIII hid a different kind of exchange, one not of diplomacy, but of disease. In Tudor England, the pox, what we now know as syphilis, was the whispered plague of the elite. It was never named outright. Courtiers spoke of it as the affliction of Venus, or the soreness below. To acknowledge it publicly was unthinkable. To treat it privately was an act of desperation. The favoured remedy was mercury, a substance believed to drive the poison out through sweat and saliva. The treatment began with a ritual of confinement. In a sealed chamber, heated by coals, the king, or whoever suffered, was stripped naked and made to inhale mercury vapour. The air shimmered with toxic mist, clinging to skin and hair. Sweat poured from the body as physicians murmured prayers of purification. The belief was simple. If the metal made you sweat, it made you clean. Next came the ointment. A thick, grey paste of mercury and animal fat was massaged into the genitals, groin and thighs, then bound tightly with linen. The ointment burned like acid. The skin blistered and peeled. The gums swelled and bled. After several hours, the wrappings were removed, leaving raw flesh that stung with every movement. The physicians nodded approvingly. The pain was a sign that the poison was departing. When symptoms returned, and they always did, the process began again. Weeks of fumes and ointments, days of fever and dizziness. The king's breath grew foul. His tongue turned black, his teeth loosened. He began to tremble slightly when signing decrees, though no one dared to comment. Mercury, they said, was the quicksilver of life. In truth, it was slow death, drop by drop. If the poison refused to yield, leeches were applied. The creatures were placed at the groin, where the flesh was soft and full of blood. They clung greedily, swelling until their translucent bodies pulsed dark red. The physicians watched the blood drain with satisfaction, believing the leeches drew out the sickness of lust itself. The king closed his eyes, enduring the pull and sting, the sound of soft slurping beneath the tapestries. These sessions were conducted in silence. The attendants, sworn to secrecy, burned the soiled linens afterward. The records called it treatment for the lower humours. No one dared use the real word. The mistresses involved were quietly dismissed, sent to country estates or convents, their names erased from household rolls. The disease was political, its management, an art of concealment. Henry's own health declined in patterns familiar to modern medicine. Urinary pain, rashes, cognitive fog, and unpredictable moods. The court doctors, clinging to their humoral theories, mistook mercury poisoning for imbalance of bile. To correct it, they prescribed more purges, more heat, more metal. It was a closed circle of madness, poison chasing poison. Each cure left the body weaker, the mouth filled with ulcers. The gums bled when touched. The sweat of mercury treatments carried a metallic tang that lingered on his clothes, on his bedclothes. Even in his breath. Servants whispered that the king's very scent had changed, that he smelled of metal and vinegar, as if rusting from within. The palace itself mirrored the cycle. Music, banquets, and laughter by day. Sickness, ointments, and leeches by night. Physicians moved like priests, administering their sacraments of metal. The line between medicine and superstition blurred until there was none at all. The irony was cruel. In trying to purge impurity, Henry filled his body with one of the deadliest substances known to man. His tremors worsened, his memory faltered, his temper became volcanic. He shouted over trifles, forgot the names of servants, struck out in fits of fury. The royal mind, once sharp and commanding, dulled under the constant fog of pain and poison. And still, the mercury continued. Because to stop was to admit defeat, to confess that kings could suffer from mortal corruption like any man. The habit of belief was stronger than the truth. Pain was reinterpreted as proof of cleansing. Decay was called transformation. Behind the curtains, the sound of dripping wax mixed with the faint hiss of vapor from the coals. A king sat sweating, bound in burning ointment, while the air shimmered with poison. Outside, the court danced to violins and lutes, unaware or unwilling to see that beneath the crown, the most powerful man in England was dissolving slowly from the inside out. Thus ended another ritual of the Tudor night. The habit of seeking salvation in mercury, a poison worshipped as medicine, and a cure that killed as surely as the disease it claimed to chase away. The 13th disgusting hygiene habit, blind faith in bad blood and the ritual of bloodletting. In the 16th century, medicine revolved around one conviction. All illness came from corrupted blood. To heal, one must let it flow out. The idea dated back to Galen's theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and by the reign of King Henry VIII, this belief had hardened into sacred ritual. Whenever the king suffered from headaches, fevers, or melancholy, the order was always the same: summon the barber, surgeon. The man would arrive carrying a silver knife, a copper bowl, and a length of clean white linen. These were the instruments of purification, gleaming in the candlelight like relics of faith. Henry would extend his arm or, in later years, a thick, swollen leg. The vein was tied with linen until it bulged blue beneath the skin. Then came the incision, quick, shallow, deliberate. The blood that spurted out was supposed to be black, proof that the evil humours were escaping. The darker the flow, the better the omen. The surgeons called it niger sanguis bonus est, dark blood is good blood, endualu. But it was never enough. When pain persisted, the king commanded, take more. Sometimes nearly a litre of blood was drawn in one sitting, the air in the chamber filled with the metallic scent of iron and sweat. The king's face turned pale, his lips cracked, and cold perspiration beaded along his collar. Still, the physicians murmured that the balance was returning. Days later, attendants would find him collapsed, faint, shivering, his pulse barely visible. They would pour wine down his throat, whispering prayers as he gasped for breath. But once revived, he ordered the same again. The ritual could not be questioned. Each bloodletting was both treatment and confession. To bleed was to cleanse, to offer one's own vitality as penance for a body's corruption. In the dim chamber, the boundaries between faith, medicine, and punishment disappeared. Every cut was a silent prayer. Every drop, an apology to a body that no longer obeyed its king. The physicians recorded each session in their ledgers with priestly precision: 3 ounces from the right arm, 6 ounces from the ankle, 1 pint from the temple, for melancholy. They believed every illness could be classified by humour and cured by its opposite. Too much warmth, bleed; too much cold, bleed less. Even wounds and ulcers, festering with infection, were treated by draining more blood, as though weakness itself could be exorcised. By his later years, Henry's veins had become scars upon scars. The skin along his arms and calves was a map of tiny slits, healed unevenly, puckered like the surface of dried fruit. Each incision had been sterilized not by alcohol, but by a dab of vinegar and a whispered prayer. The irony was grim. The more blood he lost, the weaker his body grew. His heart strained to compensate. His kidneys faltered. The ulcers on his leg, already rotting from poor circulation, grew worse. But to stop was to defy both doctrine and habit. Bloodletting was not merely a cure, it was a belief system, a proof of obedience to nature's imagined laws. When he grew feverish, the cycle began anew. Surgeons sharpened blades. Linen cloths were prepared. The bowls, polished to a mirror shine, waited beneath his chair. As the first cut opened, the king's breath grew shallow, his eyes unfocused, his voice slow, as though reciting a psalm from memory. Sometimes, during these sessions, the attendants noticed his pulse flutter and vanish. Panic rippled through the chamber, but the doctors insisted this was the moment of purification. The body, they said, must descend into weakness before rebirth. And when he finally awoke ashen, trembling, drenched in cold sweat, they called it recovery. But there was no recovery. The marrow thinned, the heart faltered. The brain, deprived of oxygen, grew sluggish and erratic. His moods swung wildly from laughter to rage to silence. The king's famous temper, once legendary, became monstrous. In truth, the ritual of bloodletting was a slow suicide written in medical Latin. It was the 13th horror, the habit of harming oneself in the name of balance. Each incision was an act of faith, a belief that suffering could equal salvation. As the years passed, the ritual grew quieter, slower. The physician's hands trembled as they worked. The bowls filled with less and less, his body had little left to give. When death finally came in January of the year 1547, it came to a man who had bled for decades, bled for health, for control, for superstition. His body was drained long before his heart stopped. In the end, the chamber was silent. The copper bowl, half filled and cooling, sat on the floor beside the bed. The linen strip, still damp with royal blood, hung from the surgeon's hand. And in that stillness, the truth lingered like the smell of iron in the air. A king who sought purification in blood found only emptiness. An empire ruled by ritual, and a body undone by belief. The 14th disgusting hygiene habit, burning incense and cleansing evil vapors in a palace of rot. By the later years of King Henry VIII's reign, the royal palaces had become sanctuaries of grandeur and of stench. Beneath the silk hangings and golden tapestries lingered the smell of decay. Sweat trapped in velvet, festering ulcers, rotting food, and chamber pots emptied too late. When the odor grew unbearable, the official order was given. Smoke out the evil vapors. Servants carried in iron braziers filled with glowing coals, setting them in corridors, under tapestries, and beside the king's bed. Onto the embers they sprinkled pine resin, crushed herbs, cinnamon bark, and Arabian frankincense. The smoke rose in slow, ghostly spirals, blue and sweet at first, then thick and choking. The air shimmered with heat and scent. The Tudors believed that disease did not spread through germs, which were unknown to them, but through miasma, poisonous air corrupted by rot. To drive it away, they filled that same air with perfume and fire. What they created instead was a suffocating fog that made eyes sting, throats burn, and lungs ache. Still, the ritual continued. The more powerful the smell, the stronger the illusion of purity. During the sweltering summers of the 1540s, the royal bedchamber became a sealed furnace. Curtains were drawn tight to keep out bad drafts, while braziers burned hour after hour. The king, wrapped in furs even in July, sat sweating amid the haze. Candles flickered dimly through the smoke. Attendants fainted quietly, one by one, slipping out to gasp for air in the courtyard. When they returned, they found the king serene, eyes half closed, whispering that the evil vapors were retreating. By morning, the chamber stank of resin, sweat, and faint sickness. The walls were filmed with soot. The bed linens absorbed the perfume until even clean cloth smelled of fire. The windows remained shut until the smoke had done its work. By then, the true culprits, the bacteria, the mold, the spores, had already found new homes on the drapes, the plaster, the food. The cleansing had sealed them in. Every season brought a new smoke ceremony. When plague threatened London in the year 1543, priests and physicians alike prescribed fumigation as divine protection. Barrels of juniper and myrrh burned day and night in the halls of Whitehall Palace. The king's courtiers, coughing through scented haze, carried pomanders, silver balls filled with herbs pressed to their noses. The air shimmered gold in torchlight, beautiful and toxic all at once. The ritual became as much performance as medicine. At court, smoke meant devotion, scent meant sanctity. To question the practice was to risk being called impious or fearful. So the doctors prescribed incense instead of fresh air. The priests prayed through the choking fumes, and the courtiers nodded solemnly as if watching sin itself being burned away. Yet the truth crept quietly beneath the ritual. The closed rooms bred infection. The smoke left residue on food and drink. The water that cooled the braziers grew foul with ash. Servants who cleaned the ash pits coughed blood into their rags. But the reports written for the royal physicians said only, "The air has been purified by fire." At night, when the king lay in bed, the walls themselves seemed to breathe. The heavy curtains, saturated with scent and moisture, exhaled the day's accumulation of oils and rot. Sometimes, in the half-dark, the smoke took on strange shapes, faces, wings. The suggestion of movement, and the superstitious whispered that these were the spirits being driven out. But nothing truly left. The odour returned, always, heavier and more sour than before. It clung to the king's beard, to the folds of his robes, to the silver cups and the velvet cushions. It followed him from palace to palace, Hampton Court, Whitehall, Greenwich, like an invisible procession of ghosts. The ceremony of smoke and scent became a metaphor for the reign itself. Appearances preserved at the cost of breath. The Tudor court lived inside its own illusion, choosing to choke on incense rather than open a window to truth. By the final years, the palace smelled not of sanctity, but of fatigue. Resin no longer masked the sourness. Perfume only sweetened the decay. The air was a heavy mixture of burnt herbs, and human despair a fragrance of denial. This was the 14th horror, the habit of replacing rot with ritual and calling the haze salvation. In the flickering glow of braziers, courtiers bowed their heads as smoke coiled upward, believing they were cleansing the air, when all they were truly doing was teaching themselves to live within it. And so, the kingdom of England, draped in incense and gilded in denial, breathed its own sickness in and out, night after night, while the king himself sat calmly in the fog, convinced the stench was leaving, unaware that it had already seeped into his lungs, his palace, and his legacy. The 15th disgusting hygiene habit, the cult of the image, repainting the face, denying the flesh. By the final decade of King Henry VIII's reign, the man himself had become a ruin encased in gold. His body bloated, ulcerated, and decaying was no longer fit for the throne. Yet in the halls of Whitehall Palace, he still ruled, immortalized in pigment and illusion. The royal painters, led by Hans Holbein the Younger, were commanded to preserve not the truth but the legend. Canvas became a form of hygiene, every portrait a cleansing. The smell of rot might fill the corridors, but the paintings smelled of oil, varnish, and glory. Holbein, the most gifted of his generation, understood what was expected. His brushes sculpted a monarch of myth, broad shoulders, piercing eyes, stance like a war god. The stomach, once massive and diseased, was flattened by shadow. The legs, swollen and ulcered beneath layers of silk, were hidden under heavy folds of fabric. The face, once florid and pocked with pain, was smooth as marble, illuminated by an almost divine glow. What hung in the audience chamber was not a man, but a resurrection. Visitors entering the court saw a giant of health, a symbol of divine strength. They bowed before an image, while the real Henry 3 rooms away sat panting in his chamber, his skin pale, his wounds leaking through the bandages, his breath sour with medicine and infection. Between the painted canvas and the living body lay an entire kingdom's act of denial. The king believed in the illusion. He studied his portraits like scripture, seeing in them proof that he still commanded destiny. When the courtiers praised the likeness, he smiled faintly, half aware that what they admired was not him, but an echo of a younger self, long gone. The painters knew better. They worked in silence, under supervision, aware that a misplaced shadow could mean disgrace or worse. They retouched reality with care, brightening the eyes, tightening the jaw, lifting the corners of a mouth that had long forgotten how to smile. Each brushstroke was a lie polished into permanence. This, too, was a form of royal cleanliness, not of body, but of image. To purify the king's appearance was to purify the idea of kingship itself. Truth was a contagion, beauty, the only disinfectant. The illusion reached beyond the palace. Copies of Holbein's portrait were sent throughout England and across Europe to ambassadors, allies, and future brides. Everywhere, people saw the same man, ageless, formidable, untouchable. The myth of Henry's vitality continued to govern long after his body had ceased to obey him. Even the courtiers began to believe their own fiction. They dined beneath the painted gaze of eternal youth, convincing themselves that the man they served was still whole. They ignored the smell that seeped through the walls, the muffled groans from the royal chamber. The portrait had become the monarch, and the monarch had become its ghost. At night, when the torches burned low, the painting seemed almost alive. The eyes, cool, blue, unblinking, watched over a palace built on pretense. In the flickering light, they appeared to move, to follow, to judge. Servants whispered that the king's spirit had already entered his own likeness, leaving behind only a shell of flesh and pain. The habit of repainting reality was more than vanity, it was policy. It was how an empire maintained dignity in decay. To question the truth was treason. To admire the illusion was loyalty. Thus, painters became priests, and pigment became prayer. By the year 1547, when Henry's health collapsed completely, the final portraits still portrayed him as eternal. His death mask would later reveal the opposite: cheeks sunken, mouth twisted, eyes dim. But the painting survived, and so did the myth. This was the 15th horror, the habit of worshipping an image until the truth rotted away behind it. A nation that once believed in holiness now believed in portraits. The artist's brush had become the new sacrament, and the king's body, corrupt and mortal, was washed clean not by water, but by the smooth deceit of paint and light. In the end, Henry VIII achieved what every mortal king desires: not immortality, but erasure. The man disappeared behind his own reflection. The empire inhaled the scent of oil and varnish, and called it purity. And history, too, forgot to breathe, lost between the fragrance of paint and the silence of truth. The 16th disgusting hygiene habit: laziness, dependence on the sedan chair, and the fear of stairs. After the catastrophic jousting accident of the year 1536, King Henry VIII never fully recovered. His once powerful legs, symbols of vigor and pride, became swollen, ulcerated, and mottled with dark, bulging veins. The right knee, struck by a lance and crushed under armor, swelled to the size of an apple. The skin broke easily, leaking pus and blood, and every step sent shockwaves of pain through his body. From that moment on, climbing stairs became a royal ordeal, a ritual of humiliation disguised as ceremony. Each time the king moved between chambers, 4 attendants were required to lift him into a specially designed sedan chair, padded with velvet and lined with embroidered linen. 2 servants held the poles, one steadied the back, and another kept a hand beneath the king's knee to prevent it from twisting. The movement was slow, uneven, and echoing wood, creaking under the weight of a man who once danced and hunted with the grace of a soldier. At Whitehall Palace, where the staircases spiraled steep and narrow, the routes were modified for his frailty. The steps were covered in crimson cloth, not for decoration, but to absorb the seepage from his ulcerated legs. Servants whispered that the stains, though hidden, darkened with each passing day. The air along the stairwells carried the sour scent of medicine, old sweat, and decay. The king could no longer climb more than 30 steps without stopping to gasp. By royal decree, all councils, audiences, and suppers were moved to the ground floor. The palace itself reshaped around his disability, turning majesty into accommodation. The sedan chair became both his vehicle and his prison. For hours he sat within it, swaddled in silks, watching the world drift past at shoulder height. His body softened, his muscles wasted, and his mind dulled with stillness. The man who once embodied motion, the hunter, the jouster, the warrior king, now ruled from cushion. From his window he watched courtiers ride horses across the fields of Greenwich, the sunlight glinting off their armour. Sometimes he ordered them to hunt on his behalf, to bring him venison or pheasant as tribute. But when the sound of hooves faded, only silence remained, broken by the hiss of his own laboured breath. The fear of stairs soon grew into something deeper, a fear of movement itself. Each attempt to stand risked pain, a torn ulcer, or a collapse. Servants kept basins of water and cloths nearby, to mop the fluid that leaked from his bandages. Even the lightest contact could make him wince. His once thunderous voice softened into short, irritated commands. The throne room once on an upper level was recreated below, in a chamber with low ceilings and narrow windows. There, he sat motionless for hours, signing decrees he barely read, while the weight of his body crushed the cushion beneath him. The courtiers knelt as always, but the symbolism had changed. The king's stillness was no longer majesty, it was paralysis. With every passing year, his dependence deepened. Servants carried him not only upstairs, but across courtyards, down corridors, into carriages. They were his legs now, and though he ordered them about with royal ferocity, he feared them too. Every touch, every lift, every stumble reminded him that his life depended on their strength. The man who had once ruled by commanding movement was now ruled by those who carried him. The chair itself became an object of superstition. Its arms were polished by royal sweat, its cushions indented by years of use. When the king was not in it, it stood in the corner like a relic, a reminder of how power can harden into immobility. Even the courtiers adapted their behavior. None approached the chair too quickly, for fear of startling him. They bowed lower than before, their movements exaggerated, as if mirroring the slowness of the king himself. The entire court began to move at his pace, hesitant, deliberate, heavy. This lethargy infected more than his body. It seeped into the machinery of the realm. Decisions slowed, decrees stalled. The empire, vast and energetic in its conquests, now mirrored its master's condition, powerful but unable to climb. By the year 1545, Henry had not walked unaided for nearly a decade. His muscles had wasted to softness, and his legs were wrapped in linen that stuck to the wounds beneath. Even his breathing followed a pattern of effort and collapse. For the public, he was still the mighty lion of England. In truth, he was a man trapped in his own weight, staring at the staircase he would never climb again. This was the 16th horror, the habit of surrendering motion to comfort, of mistaking immobility for control. The sedan chair was not merely a tool of luxury, it was a throne of denial. In that padded prison, the great king who once moved armies with a gesture now feared a single misstep. The world shrank to the size of a corridor. The empire itself became an echo of his body, grand, decaying, and still. The 17th disgusting hygiene habit, hoarding hair, nails, and blood as holy relics. In the final decade of King Henry VIII's reign, when his body had begun to betray him, a new superstition took root in the royal chamber. Quiet, macabre, and strangely intimate. The king came to believe that every fragment of himself, every hair plucked, every fingernail clipped, every droplet of blood spilled was sacred. He was the anointed vessel of God, he reasoned. Therefore, no part of him could ever be discarded. Each time his barber approached with the silver shears, the ritual began. A servant held a basin lined with fine linen, while the locks of Henry's hair, once copper gold, now streaked with grey, fell in heavy curls. None were swept away. Each strand was counted, wrapped in cloth, and sprinkled with ground myrrh and lavender, then sealed with wax. The same was done with the trimmings of his nails, collected after every grooming session and labelled with the date and the royal seal. When the king underwent bloodletting, the residue clotted, dark, metallic-smelling was also saved. The royal physicians whispered that this sacred matter still carried the vital spirit, and that to destroy it was to risk offending heaven itself. The relics were kept in small cedar chests, stored near the king's bed, 3 boxes in total, each marked with the sign of the cross, and bound with iron clasps. Inside, the linen bundles multiplied over the years. The cedar no longer masked the scent. It began to weep sap, mingling with the iron tang of dried blood and the damp sweetness of decaying fabric. By the year 1545, the odour of rust and mildew clung to the royal bedchamber, faint but persistent, like a memory that refused to fade. The attendants assigned to this grim duty treated the fragments with religious caution. They wore gloves of soft kid leather and spoke only in whispers. To drop a strand of hair or misplace a nail was a punishable offence. No one dared to burn the remnants, for fire was seen as sacrilege, an act of erasing what had once been divine. So the relics accumulated, month after month, sealed in linen, stained with time. Sometimes, on sleepless nights, Henry asked that the boxes be opened. The lids creaked, releasing the smell of old iron and musty herbs. He would reach in with trembling fingers, lift a bundle to his nose, and close his eyes as though inhaling proof of his own permanence. To him, these were tokens of control, small victories over decay. The body might falter, the flesh might turn against him, but here within these wrappings his essence remained preserved. The physicians humoured him. They spoke of continuity of humours and the circle of vital heat, weaving pseudoscience into comfort. They told him that the body's fragments carried the reflection of royal order. But the servants, who had to handle these remnants daily, knew better. They watched as the bundles grew damp, as drops of condensation appeared on the cloth in humid weather, as the faint odour of ferrous rot deepened each summer. By then, even the cedar chest began to warp. The hinges stuck. The iron clasps left reddish stains on the silk covers. Yet still, no one was allowed to clean or destroy them. "Nothing that has belonged to the king shall be lost," the steward of the chamber declared. And so, the small room beside the royal bed became a kind of ossuary, a shrine to the body in fragments. It was said that one night, during a fever, Henry demanded to see all that had been taken from him. The attendants carried the chests to his bedside. He ordered them opened and stared at the contents bundles upon bundles, each marked by date and hand. He asked how many years of his life they represented. One servant answered softly, "Nearly 12, Your Majesty." "Oh." For a moment he said nothing. Then, with a trembling smile, he murmured, "Then I am still whole." But the truth was less comforting. The linen wrappings, damp with age, had begun to rot. Mould bloomed on the corners. The faint rust red of blood had turned to brown. The nails, once pale and crescent-shaped, had yellowed, curled, and split. His hair, when unwrapped, fell apart at a touch. It was no preservation, only the slow decay of what he could not let go. And yet, the ritual continued until the end. When he died in the year 1547, the cedar boxes were sealed once more and buried deep within Whitehall's storerooms. None dared open them again. Some whispered that the smell of iron still haunted the corridor outside his bedchamber for years after. This was the 17th horror, the habit of hoarding the body to outwit death. A man who had conquered wives, churches, and nations could not conquer time. So he gathered his own fragments, piece by piece, until the line between preservation and decay vanished. In those boxes, the king kept not proof of eternity, but evidence of surrender, the quiet, rusting relics of a man who feared to lose even the parts of himself that were already gone. The 18th disgusting hygiene habit, eating with bare hands and rubbing fat into the skin as royal moisturizer. By the middle of the 16th century, King Henry VIII had grown into a man ruled as much by appetite as by ambition. His banquets were monuments to excess tables bending under roasted swans, peacocks glazed in sugar, venison pies heavy with spice, and towers of marzipan glistening with gold leaf. But while the courses dazzled the ambassadors and courtiers, what came after the way he handled food left a different kind of impression. Henry preferred the tactile pleasure of eating. Forks were already in limited use among the European elite, but the English king found them effeminate. He liked the feel of meat's texture beneath his fingers, the weight of fat-drenched poultry, the sticky heat of roasted pork. He tore the flesh apart with his hands thick, jeweled fingers slick with grease, and claimed that the food tastes truer to the touch of a man. When the meal ended, the others washed at the basins. The king did not. Instead, he called for a small silver bowl filled with melted goose fat or chicken drippings, sometimes scented faintly with clove or rosemary. He dipped his fingertips into it and began to rub the fat into his hands and wrists, spreading it across the back of his palms as though it were balm. To him, this was not indulgence, it was therapy. He believed that animal fat held warmth, that it sealed the pores against cold humors, and that the skin of a ruler must never be allowed to crack. He told his barber once, a king's hand should feel like victory, smooth, oiled and strong. The attendants wrote otherwise. They noted that, by the year 1540, the king's skin had become coarse, flushed, and often emitted a faint, sour odour. The constant layering of fat mingled with smoke from the torches, ash from the hearth, and the faint metallic tang of his medicine. Over time, his fingers developed a film of residue that never quite washed away a mixture of grease, sweat, and perfume. The texture, one servant whispered, was like wax that sweats. End of. At banquets, the odour hung in the air long after he had gone. When he reached out to clasp the hands of envoys or to bless documents, the parchment sometimes showed translucent fingerprints, small, greasy moons that caught the candlelight. No one dared to mention it. To comment on the smell of the king's hands was to insult the crown itself. After each feast, his linens were replaced, not because they were dirty, but because they shimmered faintly with oil. The cloths were rinsed with vinegar and rosewater, but the scent never left. The laundresses began to nickname them the royal skins. Henry called the ritual preserving warmth. His physicians, eager to flatter him, reinforced the habit. They claimed that rubbing the fat of beasts restored vitality, strengthened the sinews, and nourished the blood. What nourishes the body, one of them wrote, may also nourish the skin. And so, at the close of nearly every meal, he continued the same slow gesture, palms together, rubbing, coating, polishing, as if blessing himself with the spoils of his appetite. When the winters grew cold, he ordered rendered pork fat, mixed with ground amber and musk, to be brought in a small gold jar. He kept it beside his bed, and sometimes, in the middle of the night, he would dip a finger into the jar and anoint the backs of his hands. The warmth soothed him. The smell filled the chamber. To him, it was the fragrance of health. To others, it was the smell of a man dissolving into his own feast. Over time, the fat congealed beneath his nails. The skin between his fingers darkened, and small pustules appeared, an infection born of indulgence. The royal surgeons lanced them, drained the pus, and advised moderation. But he ignored them. Cleanliness, to his mind, was not the absence of filth, the presence of power. To wash away the fat would be to wash away the proof of his dominance, the scent of meat, of triumph, of plenty. The linens he used to wipe his hands were collected and replaced daily, yet none were discarded. The household accounts mentioned that dozens of these rose cloths were kept in storage, heavy with oil and perfume. Over time they grew rancid, their perfume turning sharp and sour. Still, the king insisted they be saved. Their smell, he said, reminded him of the hunt, of the roast, of victory. By the year 1546, the habit had become legend among the court. Pages were warned never to stand too close when serving, lest a drop of hot grease fall upon their tunics or skin. Those who did speak privately of the odour called it the smell of the feast itself, a scent that clung to walls, tapestries, and memory. And so, beneath the glitter of the Tudor banquets, beneath the trumpets and golden goblets, the king's body exhaled its own truth. The scent of decay, disguised as luxury. This was the 18th horror, the habit of eating with bare hands and anointing them with fat as medicine. In the flickering light of the banquet hall, Henry's fingers shone like polished ivory, but they were not clean. They were monuments to appetite, coated in the residue of empire and excess. Each motion, each rub of grease upon skin was a small act of faith in corruption, a belief that indulgence could heal, that decay could be made holy, and that the body of a king was too sacred to wash. The 19th disgusting hygiene habit, using urine to clean teeth and exercise the mouth. In the 16th century, the science of cleanliness was not yet born, only superstition draped in silk. Among the stranger rituals of the Tudor court, one of the most secret and most nauseating belonged to King Henry VIII himself. Each morning, before sunrise, before the council assembled and the bells of Whitehall began to toll, The king performed a ritual of mouth purification. It involved not mint or salt, but urine fresh, warm, and believed to be divine. Physicians of the age worshipped the doctrine of humours and alchemy. They taught that urine contained the essence of life, distilled by the body and infused with the natural salts of purity. Ammonia, though they did not yet know its name, gave it a sharp, cleansing sting. Italian healers, imported at great expense to the English court around the year 1538, whispered of a Florentine secret, that rinsing one's mouth with urine mixed with wine would whiten the teeth, strengthen the gums, and renew vigour. Henry believed them. Each dawn, a servant crept into the royal chamber with a small silver basin wrapped in linen. Inside was the royal water, still steaming. The urine had to be fresh, less than 1 hour old. If it cooled, it lost its spirit, according to the royal physician's notes. A few drops of red wine were added not for taste, but as an offering to sanctify the mixture. The servant knelt, presenting the bowl on a folded silk cloth. Henry took it without hesitation. Those who witnessed the scene said he tilted his head back, poured a mouthful, and let it rest between his teeth. Then came the sound, a slow gargle, a breath through his nose, and a faint sigh. He swished the liquid for several moments, then spat into another bowl of silver. The smell filled the air, sharp and acrid, and clung to the curtains long after the ritual ended. But the act did not stop there. After spitting, the king dipped a fine linen cloth into the same mixture and used it to wipe his lips, beard, and front teeth. He rubbed until the enamel gleamed, leaving streaks of pale moisture that soon dried into a thin, salty film. "The light of God shines in a clean mouth," the physician proclaimed. Henry, ever convinced of divine symbolism, smiled at his reflection and declared, "Then my breath shall be the breath of kingship." At first it seemed harmless. His teeth indeed looked whiter polished by the mild acid and salt of the liquid. His gums flushed red, giving him a look of vitality in portraits painted by Hans Holbein the Younger. But as the months passed, the enamel began to erode. The teeth dulled, turning porous, and small fissures appeared along the gum line. The once pleasant taste of wine now mingled with iron, the metallic aftertaste of blood. Still, the ritual continued. The physicians, terrified of contradicting him, praised the results. "Your Majesty's countenance glows," one wrote, though he had to breathe through a pomander ball filled with clove and cinnamon while standing near. By the early 1540s, Henry's gums had swollen. They bled when he bit into meat. His breath, already soured by medicines, laudanum, and decay, now carried a dense ammoniac edge. Courtiers standing close during audiences learned to turn their heads discreetly, to cough when he spoke. But none dared to flinch. In the Tudor court, even the king's stench was sanctified. The attendants who prepared the royal rinse followed strict instruction. The urine had to come from the king himself whenever possible. Otherwise, a healthy young page was ordered to provide it, under oath of secrecy. The bowl was heated gently over coals until it reached body temperature. A trace of rosemary or rose oil was sometimes added not to hide the odour, but to balance the humours of the spirit. As years passed, the act took on the solemnity of a prayer. Before morning mass, before breakfast, before touching the cross, the king anointed his mouth with his own waste, believing he was drawing purity from what his body expelled. The paradox pleased him. "The crown transforms all things," he once murmured. Even filth becomes gold when touched by grace. Oh? Behind closed doors, the servants whispered otherwise. They spoke of the sour smell lingering in the hall, the stains on his napkins, the silver bowls that corroded despite constant polishing. Yet none of them would speak aloud what they knew, that each rinse hastened the rotting of his teeth and the inflammation of his gums. When he laughed, flecks of blood sometimes appeared at the corners of his mouth. When he slept, his breath clouded the room. Wine, ammonia, and decay mingled into something both human and unholy. This was the 19th horror, the habit of washing purity in filth and calling it grace. In the logic of the Tudor age, the king's waste was sacred, his disease divine. The more the body decayed, the more elaborate the rituals to disguise it became. So each morning, as dawn crept through the windows of Whitehall, Henry lifted the silver bowl again. Steam rose, faint and golden. He took his first mouthful, closed his eyes, and believed, truly believed, that he was cleansing his soul. The truth was simpler and crueler. He was swallowing his own corruption, one bitter gulp at a time. As the lights of the Tudor court fade, and the echoes of the king's footsteps dissolve into silence, we are left not with the roar of power, but with the quiet rustle of mortality. The chambers of Whitehall, once heavy with the scent of meat, smoke and incense, now rest in stillness. The golden plates are gone, the courtiers dismissed, and only the ghost of Henry VIII lingers not as a tyrant or a monarch, but as a man bound to his own fragile flesh. For all his crowns, conquests and wives, Henry's story ends the same way every human story must, in the slow unravelling of the body, in the strange rituals meant to delay what cannot be stopped. His habits, as grotesque as they seem to us now, were born not only from ignorance, but from fear, the fear of losing control, of fading into dust. He sought eternity in relics of himself, in strands of hair, in drops of blood, in the taste of his own reflection. Yet all those relics, like the empire he built, could not hold back the simplest truth of life, that even kings decay, and perhaps that is what remains most human about him. Beneath the layers of silk, beneath the golden ceremony, there was a body struggling to stay alive, aching, trembling, searching for meaning in rituals that offered none. His story reminds us that no amount of grandeur, no ritual of purification or prayer, can save us from the quiet law that governs all. To live is to diminish, and to diminish is to remember what is real. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it, the whisper of linen on marble, the soft hum of a candle before it dies. The palace